I hold hope for the future of Kea in that they are smart and adaptable birds, but we really need to act to help them on their way. We know that lead poisoning is a major driver of decline in Kea, much more than you would think. Sort of anecdotally appears to be the biggest driver of mortality outside of stoat plague years. Kea don't have a fight response or a flight response when they meet a predator. At the moment, the biggest breakthrough is being able to do landscape scale predator control. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests benefits Kea populations overall.
Hello, kia ora. I'm Anna.
And I'm Callum from Conservation Amplified.
And you're listening to the People Helping Nature podcast.
Our mission is to make conservation mainstream, one topic at a time.
Today we are speaking with Lydia McLean from the Kea Conservation Trust about some of the fascinating and wonderful Kea fieldwork you're doing. Welcome, Lydia.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Would you like to start by introducing yourself and what you do with Kea at the Conservation Trust?
Yeah, so I've been working with the Kea Conservation Trust for about almost 8 years now. So I started out as a volunteer, as did many or most people who work in conservation. So I've done a lot of tramping and mountaineering in my time and thought that perhaps I could be useful on their projects. So I put my hand up and got out there in the field with them and went, oh my goodness, I can't believe that people get paid to do this. This is amazing. Love these birds, love being in the mountains. This is epic. So I sort of made myself useful, and eventually it morphed from volunteering into paid contract work for them. So I would be part of a field team that would go out and catch Kea on various projects and sample them and band them. And then things morphed further, and it sort of ended up that I was organising the projects. Alongside that, I started a PhD on Kea, and I was really lucky to be able to do my PhD at the same time as doing a lot of the Kea fieldwork contracting, so kind of best of both worlds. Now my role with the Kea Conservation Trust is very much part-time, as with all of us, leading the field and science components of the KCT's work.
Thank you for sharing that, and kia ora, welcome from me as well. So our last podcast was with Tamsin from the Conservation Trust as well, and she told us a lot about Kea and about what they are and the species as well. But I'm super curious to know, Lydia, what's your favourite fact about Kea that might surprise people?
I had to ponder this one for a little while, but most people would think of Kea as able to defend themselves, pretty vicious. Some of the scars on my fingers kind of attest to that. But actually, Kea don't have a fight response or a flight response when they meet a predator. So if they're approached by a cat or a stoat, their response is not fear, their response is curiosity, and that's their downfall. So they have evolved, like all of our native birds and fauna, to not have any predators on the ground. So they just don't know that they should fly away, that it's a danger. So they see a cat and they go, what are you? Hello. And that's their last moment. I find it fascinating, but very unfortunate that Kea don't have that fear of predators.
It's easy to, I'm going to botch the word here, but anthropomorphize? Is that right?
Yeah.
Like it's easy to put our brain on an animal and think that our view is their view.
Yeah, that's it. And they should be capable of fighting, but they just don't have it in them to do that. And obviously, like 150 years of being exposed to predators isn't enough time for them to evolve that behaviour. So yeah, they just don't do it.
So it's good that Kea Conservation Trust is here to work with them. I understand that you do a lot of projects to help Kea. To kick us off, would you like to share what the main projects you're currently working on are?
So the biggest project that I'm overseeing is in the Matukituki Valley near Wanaka. So this is a nest survivorship study through beach mast to beach mast. We catch Kea and we put transmitters on all the adult females, and then in spring we can track them to their nest. Once we're at their nests, we put motion-activated trail cameras outside to see what's going on, and then basically we check up on them every few weeks through nesting season and see whether their nests failed or not, and if they did fail, what the cause was. Alongside that, we use the data that our friends at the Matukituki Charitable Trust and Southern Lake Sanctuary collect from their trapping network, and also DOC's tracking tunnel data in our own trail cameras, so a whole lot of things to try to estimate the abundance of predators, so that's cats and stoats primarily, but also possums in the area, to understand what the dynamic is between the predator abundance and Kea nest survivorship. We also are scoping a lead surveillance project at the moment, so we've just started doing some field work for this to see whether we should invest our resources in it. So this is in areas where a lot of lead ammunition is used. So the plan there is to collect blood samples from Kea, firstly to see whether they do have a high incidence of lead poisoning in those areas. And if they do, we want to analyse the isotopes in their blood to confirm that the lead poisoning does come from ammunition rather than other sources. We'll also collect some tiny little feather snippets so we can get a timeline of their lead exposures. The feathers reflect lead exposure over the past year or so, whereas blood reflects their kind of lead exposure within the past few weeks, so we can see when they were exposed to lead. We also had some big nest survivorship studies in Fiordland, in the Murchison Mountains and the Stewart Mountains. That was in conjunction with the Fiordland Wapiti Foundation, who helped us with a lot of our field work and catching and banding Kea for that. So very similar methods to what we were doing in the Matukituki, putting transmitters on adult females and tracking them to their nests. And the aim of that project was to see whether the very big trap network in the Murchison Mountains, which is there to protect the takahe population, was benefiting Kea relative to a neighbouring range next door, which receives very limited predator control. So we were aiming to see whether the trapping was making a difference. That project has wound down in the last couple of years, largely just due to resourcing. It's incredibly expensive and labour intensive to run these projects, and we decided to wind that one down because we weren't able to collect data to the quality that we really needed to get our answers. And so we decided to invest in the Matukituki and do that project really well rather than spread ourselves too thin. We also do a little bit of advocacy work as well. So we go to basically the tourism hotspots and band the Kea, so places like the Milford Road, the Milford Track, the Root Burn and the Kepler. And the aim of that is to engage the public to be able to identify individual Kea. They can log their sightings on the Kea sightings database, and that enables us to keep track of individual birds and understand their movements and some of their social dynamics with group sizes and flocking behaviour. There's also projects up in Nelson Lakes that I am not particularly involved with, surrounding nest protection trials, so putting a series of traps around Kea nests to protect them from both cats and stoats, and trialling whether nest protection increases their fledging success or not.
Wow, that's very broad. That's amazing, especially weaving in research with awareness as well. That is so important. So with Kea being often in remote country, can you walk us through what a typical day of Kea conservation in the field looks like?
It's not for the faint-hearted. Generally, we avoid using helicopters where possible, largely just due to the expense of them, but where it's necessary we do. But most of the time it involves walking or four-wheel driving up a valley as far as possible. I'll use the Matukituki as an example. So we're very lucky to have access through Aspiring Station, so we can get all our gear and food for a week up to a base on the bottom of the valley. And then we would divide into teams. So we always have a qualified Kea bander leading each team, and then either trainee banders or volunteers as their assistants. So we'd have a team of at least 2, but generally 3 or 4 is preferable because it can get a bit hectic. We'd load up our tramping packs. It's like a big multi-day tramp. So we've got all our gear, our sleeping bags and food and cookers and tents, and then our catch gear as well. We would walk up to above bushline. So often that's 1,000 metres straight up, vertical elevation, and find a suitable campsite somewhere where we can camp and we have access to water, but also somewhere that's a good Kea catch site. So generally Kea like to land somewhere they feel safe, so somewhere next to a rock which overlooks our campsite where they can sit and feel like they've got a safe exit. Then we would set up our noose mats. So these are our catching devices for Kea. They're essentially many thousand-year-old technology. They're basically snares that we tether to the ground really securely, and we play Kea calls through a very loud Bluetooth speaker and call them in from across the valley. and lure them into the mats where we can catch them. Once we've got them in hand, we will band them with a permanent metal band and then a plastic band that is easy to ID from a distance, so we can tell who's who without having to handle them. And then depending on the project, we'll also collect blood samples for lead or genetic analyses, feather samples. We'll always measure the birds and then we'll release them. So that's a day of catching. A day of telemetry, so that's following up the transmitters, is a little bit more challenging. So these transmitters that are on the adult females, or if you're studying just adult survivorship, they'll be on all adult Kea. They emit a radio signal, so sort of like an avalanche transceiver. So just a beep. Generally, we'd get a tracking flight done. So a fixed wing aeroplane would fly over in the days before and get an estimate of where they believe the Kea nests are. And then we'd receive a map with GPS waypoints on it. And we will get out our aerials and our little receivers and wave our aerials around, and they're directional, so you get a direction that the beep is coming from. But it's pretty clunky technology, so we have to walk around and triangulate. So generally we'd walk up and down the valley and kind of start drawing lines of where we think the signal is coming from, and you end up kind of drawing a little asterisk on your map and saying centered on a certain point. And then often we'd also do the same across the ridgeline before we commit to going into that exact spot to find the transmitter. So we get thwarted by all sorts of things, cliffs with radio signals bouncing. If the plane pilot's point is a little bit off, often that throws you. Sometimes you start to wonder if the Kea is actually moving around, but in the case of a nesting female, she shouldn't be moving, or if we're trying to find a mortality signal, also shouldn't be moving. So sometimes you start to question your own sanity a bit. So yeah, generally to track down a transmitter will take a day. Worst case scenario, it can take 3 or 4 days. I've got some horror stories. So it's all off track through the bush, just making good decisions about the country that you're in and keeping yourself safe at the same time.
It's pretty intrepid.
Yeah, I guess calling them in versus finding them where they want to be, that's very different, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So what are the current trends, and are there any knowledge gaps that you would like to fill?
One of the concerning trends we're observing seems to be a range contraction. So we talk about these edgy eastern Kea. I love to think of a little cartoon picture of like a punk Kea being real edgy, but that's not really what it is. It's the Kea that are on the eastern edge of their range. So that's places like the Craigieburns, Arthur's Pass, Lewis Pass, Queenstown. They're really struggling. They're disappearing. They are almost gone from the Kaikoras, and we'd love to see them return there. And they appear to still be doing fine in the western area, so sort of the core of their range, so southwestland and Fieldland. They appear to be doing okay. So what we have been working on is focusing on understanding what is driving the population decline in these eastern areas, and then what we can do to protect or to recover those populations and protect the birds in the core range. In terms of knowledge gaps, I suppose there's many. We don't really understand yet the impact of cats on Kea. We know that they are bad. We haven't done any really thorough studies to understand cat predation on Kea and what effect cat control would have. We know that lead poisoning is a major driver of decline in Kea, much more than you would think. Sort of anecdotally appears to be the biggest driver of mortality outside of stoat plague years, really quite bad. And then there's all sorts of basic ecological questions that we don't know about Kea. So how far do they typically travel? Do the males eat differently from the females, eat a different diet, which is partly what my PhD was looking into? What are the major drivers of their risk to eating things like 1080? Is there seasonal diet differences? There's lots and lots of questions that we still have to answer.
It's funny, pulling back the hood, it's like the more we know, the more we realise we don't know.
Yeah, that's it.
When it comes to collecting data to improve our learning, what are the methods you use to collect data about the negative impact that invasive predators are having?
That's where the nest survivorship studies come in. These methods using radio transmitters, which essentially tell us where a Kea is, and from that we can determine whether it's alive or not. And then we use trail camera data. From that, we can create an index, I suppose, of predator sightings per 10-minute period within a time frame. So we can kind of get a graph of whether there's lots and lots of predators, like lots and lots of 10-minute chunks of time that we see a predator in versus not. The reason we do 10 minutes is because one stoat might hang around the camera for 5 minutes and then carry on. It's kind of just the index that we use. We're aware that we might be double counting some of them, so that's why we call it an index rather than a count. And then methods that we use for the lead stuff is using stable isotopes. Basically, lead comes in various different kind of forms, a heavier form and a lighter form. My background is in carbon and nitrogen isotopes, so I'm not super fluent in these heavy metal ones. Basically, lead from mines that was used in historic structures mostly came from Australia, whereas lead from ammunition that's currently used mostly comes from the Northern Hemisphere. And those two sources of lead have got slightly different isotope signatures, so slightly more or less of the heavier lead isotopes. Then when we collect a blood sample from Kea, you can see whether that lead reflects the ratio of the isotopes from the Australian mines or the Northern Hemisphere mines, and that enables us to tell where the lead came from, so whether it's ammunition or buildings.
I find it fascinating. It's amazing what we can do with technology. But coming back to the predator control, in a recent episode we spoke with John Biston, who's an expert on trap shyness. Is this a challenge that you've encountered when it comes to protecting Kea?
The Kea Conservation Trust doesn't directly do trapping, but we benefit from the amazing efforts that lots of community organisations and DOC does. I know that in the likes of the Murchison Mountains in Fiordland, the trapping has been going on for decades, and because it's ecology, there's never a definitive yes-no answer, but it does appear that trapping is becoming less effective. So the thought behind that is that essentially we're selecting for trap shy stoats that are then going on to pass their trap shy genes to their offspring. We struggle to prove that. So the solution is to come up with new tools, new techniques, new lures that will be able to attract those trap shy stoats in. So in many areas, using aerial poison as basically a reset is quite effective, but if that is not possible, then even just changing the lures and traps can make a difference. And I know there's lots of trials with sort of trap numbers, changing lures versus not changing lures is going on at the moment. So we don't really know ourselves in terms of Kea numbers. We haven't yet seen any difference in areas that are supposedly trap shy versus areas that aren't.
Yeah, right. So after a long period of time doing trapping, you have this really intelligent predator population. So how does that tie into aerial poison? Like, why do we use aerial poisons to support the traps?
That's a great question. I guess to refer to the Murchison Mountains again, this is a network of 3,500 traps. It's a major undertaking for DOC to manage it. These traps, once they're set off, have to be cleared of the nasty remains of the rat or stoat that it's caught and reset by hand. These traps are in very remote, rugged alpine areas, and they need to be set with the home range of a stoat in mind. So basically the network needs to be dense enough to actually get all the stoats. So these 3,500 traps take around about 70 person days to service, and they need to be serviced 6 times a year. That is one little peninsula in Fiordland. Well, it's not little, but you know what I mean. So if we were to roll that out over the mainland, we would not have enough people to service those traps. We also have a huge amount of maintenance, not only on the traps, but also track cutting, keeping those lines safe. The people who service them are extraordinary. They are basically mountain guides. They're incredibly fit, rugged, hardy people who are willing to be in the outdoors for 8 days at a time, solo, getting wet, scraping maggoty, writhing rat guts out of a trap for very little pay. So those guys are absolute heroes. We just can't scale it up much more than what we currently have. So the solution for that is to aerially poison some of these areas, so using 1080. So these areas are generally huge swaths of land, so we're looking at often between 40 to 60,000 hectares. The 1080 is sown at a rate that it's within the home range of a rat, because a rat needs to eat the poison first and then pass on the poison to a stoat by a secondary poisoning. So the stoat eats the dead rat, and then that knocks the stoats down. So I suppose the rationale for 1080 is that it's our only option to treat these really rugged areas at the moment. We couldn't possibly trap them. We also wouldn't want to let them go because the stoats and the possums and the rats would take over. It's sort of an ethical question whether you let supposedly nature take its course, but that would inevitably result in extinctions. And I guess as a nation, we've decided that we don't want to have extinctions. And so that means that we 1080 the areas that we choose to prioritise.
I think your message was super critical here, right? It's 1080 or extinction of our endemic or native species. That's what it comes down to. And I'm sure we'll progress and have better technology in the future.
Yeah, that's it. I would like to highlight that, at least personally, I don't love it. I don't celebrate throwing poison across the mountains. You know, it's our best option. It's a necessary thing to do to hold the line. It's the best tool we've got right now. So in the absence of any other magical unicorn tools, we just have to keep using it to hold the line.
I fully agree and I second that. I'm just really curious. We've talked a lot about predators and lead threats, but wondering with your PhD, the work you're doing on the diet, is that something that's threatening, that their diet is changing and disappearing? How does that tie into the picture of numbers declining, if it does at all?
So my PhD originally set out to understand why kea in some areas seem to be more susceptible to eating 1080 than others, and it very quickly morphed into just becoming more of a general diet difference study. Why do kea in some areas eat a different diet to other areas, despite potentially having the same food resources? I found that the further east you go, the more vegetarian the kea are. So kea in Westland eat like almost entirely invertebrates. They eat a really, really high protein diet. And then there's almost a linear relationship with the further east you go. So once you get over to sort of the eastern side of the Southern Alps, the Craigie Burns area, they're basically vegetarian. And I don't know whether that's down to abundance of invertebrates or meat sources. So they'll also eat carrion, like dead deer and goats and hares and stuff. I don't know whether it's down to sort of their food availability or whether that is a behavioural difference between the populations. But it does appear that kea in areas that are doing well eat more protein.
Interesting. Did you find any differences of diet between kea living near human settlements versus, I guess, more remote kea?
I tried to look into that, but the data from that got really murky because I also found that young kea eat a different diet to older kea. So the younger they are, the more vegetarian they are as well. And my kind of hypothesis there was that young birds are inexperienced foragers and that often plant food sources are easier to find. So things like berries or roots, they're right in front of you, whereas you need some experience to extract hoo-hoo grubs from a rotten log or to know which stones to turn over to get whatever other larvae you're after. So my kind of idea was that the older birds are more experienced and it takes more energy input, but sort of high energy, high reward, I suppose, and that they get more protein once they actually know how to find the food. So sort of thought that it was the higher protein intake by adults may be linked to reproduction. But anyway, so what I found was that in areas closer to humans, kea tend to be younger, and in areas more remote, they tend to be older. So yes, it appears that kea are more vegetarian or they eat a lower quality diet closer to humans, but that may just be linked to their age rather than their proximity to humans.
That's so interesting. So when you're undertaking fieldwork with kea, what are some of the biggest challenges that you face?
Number one is funding and resources, and having trained people who we can keep around enough to basically keep them in a job. So most, if not all, people who work with kea have another job. So we all have to shuffle it in and around our other work that we do. Unfortunately, there's not enough funding for us to have a full-time or a couple of full-time field rangers, which would be absolutely amazing. It would be kind of totally change our research program if we were able to have that continuity. And then I suppose we're thwarted by a whole lot of other things, the weather being a big one. So working in the mountains, we have to fend for ourselves. Generally, we are camping in tents, and the best intentions can be completely ruined by a westerly coming through and having to cancel trips and reschedule.
How do you deal with it? Funding, obviously you balance it with other paid income.
Yeah, so I sort of alluded how we wound down the Murchison and Stewart Mountains project because of resource challenges. In the last couple of years, DOC has really stepped up with their Kea research, which has been really great. So the Kea Conservation Trust has essentially filled a gap in the absence of any DOC projects for 15 or 20 years. And now DOC's stepping up, which means that the Kea Conservation Trust can design smaller projects that are more thoroughly thought through and can be completed in a shorter time frame. And that means we can leave these big multi-$100,000 projects for DOC to oversee and hopefully resource better than a little charity can. So this lead surveillance plan that we're putting together now is written in conjunction with the Kea Conservation Trust, DOC and Ngāi Tahu. So it's a Kea Recovery Group project. The Kea Conservation Trust will play a part in that. So we will do lead surveillance in some areas and contribute to that, but everybody will be participating their part into it. So that means that we can overcome some of those funding issues. It means that Kea Conservation Trust can move much more into an advocacy space. That's our strength, in that we are independent from DOC and we can have different opinions, and we have often had different opinions in the past about management. We can advocate and we can heckle DOC into listening to our side of the story, but also we can do community engagement and be much more nimble with our messaging and our opinions and talking to the public.
Makes sense in many ways, because if you've got more partners and stakeholders at the table, you can get more done and focus on your specialty. Doing smaller projects, I've heard a number of conservation casualties where we have bite off way more than we can chew, and then you have all these half-finished projects that just fall by the wayside and it's too late to finish the data, etc.
Yeah.
So that's really good. And I think as far as advocacy goes, like Kea are, despite being such an iconic bird, they still have a lot less awareness than they should. And so by focusing on the advocacy, you can bring more eyeballs, which results in more dollars over time to them.
That's it. I should say, like, a big shout out to all the organisations and people who do sponsor our work. That's amazing, and that has enabled us to do so much research over the years. But we have been in the situation where it's sort of like the tail's wagging the dog, and that somebody's got some sponsorship money, but it's for a particular purpose or a particular area or a particular project, which often really aligns with what we're after. But sometimes it doesn't, or it's kind of peripheral to our overall goals. And so we really need to be careful that it's not the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, and that we are saying this is the projects we need to do. Do you have the funds for it? Rather than somebody saying, hey, I've got funds for you to do this specific thing.
Yeah. And I can just second that from my own experience. And I think, talking about research, what have been your biggest breakthroughs to date for Kea conservation?
Well, that is actually a tricky one. I am anticipating a breakthrough on the horizon with a new method of delivering 1080 that will reduce the risk to Kea significantly. I don't have the details on exactly how it will work, but essentially it's a meat sausage that is targeted directly to stoats, so they won't need a rat vector to pass on the poison. The reason that we're excited about this is because, one, there will be so much fewer poison baits dropped from the air, and the other reason is that the actual dose, the actual concentration of 1080 in those baits is much, much lower because it doesn't need to go through a rat vector. We have some confidence that both the low concentration in these baits and the fact that there's so much fewer of them going out, that it will massively reduce the risk for Kea. Obviously, we have absolutely nothing to back that up yet. There will be a lot of field trials and certifications to get through before that becomes a reality, but if that happens, it'll be major for Kea conservation. I suppose at the moment, though, the biggest breakthrough is being able to do landscape scale predator control. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests benefits Kea populations overall.
That's awesome. I'm really curious, when you drop 1080 or aerial poisons for that matter. How do you keep these cheeky kea from eating it? How do you prevent them from just going directly and eating that bait?
So this is research that has mostly been DOC-led recently. So basically anything 1080 related will be DOC-led rather than Kea Conservation Trust-led. There's been quite a bit of repellent research lately. So there is a bird repellent called anthraquinone, which is used overseas. It's used for crop protection, so to protect, say, sunflower crops from getting destroyed by birds. Anthraquinone, unfortunately, also repels possums and rats, so that makes it really tricky to administer in a operation so that Kea are repelled, but not possums and rats. So the way it works is it's a secondary repellent. The Kea eats a bait that contains, it's non-toxic, but it contains anthraquinone, and they feel sick from that. And then they learn an aversion to those, much like many of us probably have done after a big night out. So we need to administer the pre-feed non-toxic repellent baits in such a way that Kea can access them, but not rats and possums. There was a lot of work that went into creating some dispensers that were put all around an area that was going to be receiving 1080. Over 100 Kea were transmitted. So the transmitters basically tell us if the Kea has died or stopped moving, and we can go and find its body and send it off for post-mortem to confirm the cause of death. So we had 100 Kea with transmitters on, both inside and outside of a 1080 operation area. Prior to the operation, we put out these repellent baits and tried to monitor Kea interactions with them, so using trail cameras, and these birds are banded so you can ID individuals. We did the 1080 operation and we monitored Kea mortality both in the area that had received the repellent and the area outside of the repellent. Unfortunately, there was no difference. So that was a real bugger, but it is what it is. Kea are never simple. So in the zoo, these anthraquinone trials work really well. In captivity, where the birds have nothing better to do than eat a whole bait that makes them feel sick and learn an aversion, it's very controlled and contained. But in the wild, we think there's a whole lot of other factors at play. Are there Kea that are dominating access to the dispensers? Are they eating enough of the bait to feel sick? Because the opposite of that is sort of exactly what we don't want, which is them eating a bit of a bait and learning that it's fine. Do we have enough dispensers for all the birds in an area to access them? So there's all these other things that make it really practically not feasible to do. So now trials are moving on to a different type of repellent that is a primary repellent, kind of like Kea chili, but those trials haven't started yet. So we'll wait and see and hope that we can get those off the ground and that they're successful.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Lydia. It's just all so fascinating. Once you learn more about something, there's so much to it. There's so much that we don't know that we need to find out. And I guess we are on a timer. Tamsin in the previous episode said that, is it 1 to 7,000 Kea that we estimate are left?
This is what one of the top Kea scientist Josh Kemp calls the holy grail question of Kea conservation, which is how many are there? Because they're so mobile, they can fly 200 k's in a day if they so decide. They can also be really inconspicuous, like in the forest. Sometimes they just hide in a tree and they keep their beaks shut and they actually don't tell you they're there. So they're just really hard to count. We have got population estimates from anything between 1 to 15,000, but generally we say 5 to 9. We really don't know, but it's pretty clear that it's declining.
It's just, again, hey, it's what we don't know. But based on our current knowledge, what's the outlook for the future for our Kea populations?
That really depends on what we decide to do to help them. If left to their own devices with no intervention from humans, I could see a gradual population decline. They will go extinct east of the Southern Alps. Their range will contract into Westland and Fiordland, and then who knows whether they would cling on. They've survived all sorts of, upheavals and glaciations to this point. The thing that they have in their favour is that they're incredibly adaptable. They're generalists. They will eat anything. That's thought to be why they sort of diverged from kaka many millennia ago. They're more of a generalist. They're okay at lots of things, but they don't specialize in anything other than chewing your windscreen wipers. So there's hope that they will adapt to a new future, but the predator question still remains. Would they cling on if we didn't do predator control over the long term, over hundreds of years? That's really up to us to decide. Do we continue to intensively control stoats and cats? How much resource do we put into that? Which areas do we choose if we can't do all of them? Obviously, DOC's 1080 regimes take into consideration much more than just Kea, so they're looking at protecting an ecosystem. So often they're not protecting the areas where Kea are in sharpest decline, they're protecting the core range areas. I hold hope for the future of Kea in that they are smart and adaptable birds, but we really need to act to help them on their way.
Yeah, for sure.
What a powerful message. And I think that's true. It is really up to us and how we protect their environment, how we step up. So if people listening want to have a positive impact on Kea conservation or Kea in general, what are your practical tips on how they can help?
Our number one message to people is please don't feed them. This is for a number of reasons. Not only is human food bad for them, but also it changes their behavior. It makes them hang out around, and that exposes them to all sorts of other dangers like vehicle strike, electrocution, lead poisoning, and it also, there's evidence that humans feeding Kea increases their risk of eating 1080. So that is the number one thing that people can do is A, not feed them, and B, tell your friends not to feed them. For people that spend quite a bit of time in the outdoors, there is a Kea survey app. I really encourage you to download it. It might be good for your listeners actually because they're obviously pretty switched on people. It requires a little bit of scientific integrity in that you need to decide that you're surveying before you go into any Kea habitat. Basically, this app will pull your GPS location, and for every hour that you're out there, you say whether you saw Kea or not. It's really simple. That absence data is so important. Being able to see that over a course of many surveys, there's been, 300 hours in this little square on the map and 0 Kea have been seen is really important data. And then we can use that over time to see how the populations are going up or down. So download that app and it's got instructions on how to use it.
What's the app called?
It's called Kea Survey. It's on Apple and Google Play, and if you just put in Kea Survey, it will come up. For those people that don't spend so much time in the outdoors, we would love you to use the Kea database. This is different, so it's keadatabase.nz, and that's to report your sightings. You can always use both. If you're using the survey app and then you do see a Kea, you can report the sighting as well through the other tool. This means that we can track individual movements, so if the Kea is banded, you can say that you saw it. It also tells us about things like group size, or if people can tell the difference between an adult and a fledgling. It helps us to estimate sort of the age ratios. If we're seeing lots of fledglings in a group, then that is sort of a proxy for nest success. So it can give us some really useful information about how a population in an area is doing. Besides that, keep discovering Kea and telling people how awesome they are. And most people already know, and go and visit them in Fiordland or Arthur's Pass or in the mountains and enjoy them.
Awesome. Oddball question, but can you give us an example of what a Kea sounds like?
I'm not the best at it because normally I use a shepherd's whistle or a blade of grass, but I'll give you a demonstration of their close range call. So not the call that you normally hear when they're flying overhead, but more of like their nice like come hither, and it goes like this. We have a recording of that call on our speaker, and it always, once they're on the ground, they always come into it. And one of our colleagues calls it Kea climbing into a hot tub.
I love it. That is so good. That is so good. Hey, lucky last question, just to wrap up. What does a healthy ecosystem look like to you, Lydia?
A healthy ecosystem has a range of native species that are thriving as they should. It looks like a forest with understory and an alpine area with ice cream plants that are not browsed. It looks like a range of bird species foraging on the ground. Basically, I've been incredibly lucky to visit some healthy ecosystems. So some of our predator-free islands, Anchor Island springs to mind, and it's a real eye-opener. And I'd encourage, if you can, any stage, get to a predator-free island to see what it should be like. Get out there and check it out. Like the saddlebacks are almost annoying how loud they are, and the mohu are chittering away, and yeah, it's pretty amazing. So yeah, don't let your baselines shift to think that a silent forest is normal. Like there's places out there that are thriving, and they're pretty amazing.
I love that, Lydia. It's a great reminder of what we could have and should have. So thank you so much for coming on, chatting Kea with us.
It's great to pull back the curtain and just have a really brief look into what your fieldwork looks like. So thank you.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Kia ora.
Yeah.